Thanks for joining us today. My name is Virginia Palacios. I'm the Executive Director of Commission Shift. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit focused on reforming oil and gas oversight in Texas. This is a video series about orphaned wells and how to make sure that inactive, unplugged wells in Texas actually get plugged and cleaned up before bad things happen. Megan, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Miliken Biven. I'm the founder of an organization called True Transition, a national organization focused on improving the working conditions of oil and gas workers in the United States and creating the jobs that they will transition into in the future. And I was lucky enough to work with Virginia last year on writing this report for recommendations for the state of Texas. And in the last few episodes, we talked about dealing with future orphaned wells, how to prevent them, how to make sure there's enough money set aside. But today we are going to be talking about existing orphan wells. What do we do to pay for them now?
Great. And so there is a state program that is already in existence. It's called the State Managed Well Plugging and Cleanup Program. And the state pays for that in several different ways. Luckily, right now, the way that they pay for it, for the most part, in history has been through industry fees and surcharges. However, right now we have these federal funds that are being injected into states across the U.S., Texas being one of the biggest beneficiaries of these federal funds to pay for plugging and cleaning up orphaned wells. But I just want to walk through how these state-level funds actually work. And so there are two big buckets of money. There is one called the Oil and Gas Regulation and Cleanup Fund, and then there's another called the General Revenue Fund. And so even though it's called the General Revenue Fund, I made this mistake early on. I thought that this was taxpayer dollars going into the General Revenue Fund, but actually the Railroad Commission has fees from oil and gas operators going into a pot that is in the General Revenue Fund, and then they also have fees and surcharges going into the Oil and Gas Regulation and Cleanup Fund. And so
are these funds sufficient? Are they collecting enough?
So no, and this is part of the problem. And so, what we see and what we've talked about on other episodes is that there's this real pileup of orphaned wells. There's 8,000 orphaned wells in Texas right now. The number keeps growing every year, even though the Railroad Commission plugs an average of 1,500 wells per year on average. And even though the Railroad Commission has, for the last 6 years, exceeded the legislature's performance measures for plugging orphaned wells. And
low expectations, guys.
Very low expectations. And, I'm glad you said that, because in the last biennium, this is how the legislature works on a 2-year cycle. In 2020 and 2021, the Railroad Commission was required to plug 1,400 wells per year. But then in the 2022 to 2023 biennium, they have only been required to plug 1,000 wells per year. And so part of this happened because there was less revenue to the state in 2020 because of the pandemic. And so there was this fear that there would just not be enough money in the budget. And so they made that performance measure much lower. They gave the legislature gave the Railroad Commission less money to deal with orphaned wells.
So how much does the Railroad Commission collect from operators?
Right, and so there are these two funds, the OGRC and the General Revenue Fund. And in those two funds, in 2021, the Railroad Commission collected $86 million into the Oil and Gas Regulation and Cleanup Fund. That is only one of the funds that is used to plug orphaned wells and clean up sites in Texas. But the Texas legislature only gave them $59 million from that fund. And so there was $27 million from the OGRC fund sitting around not being used to plug orphaned wells in 2021.
So they're just sitting on that cash and not plugging those wells.
Yeah, and that's only one fund. And so the other fund, the General Revenue Fund, had an excess $13 million sitting around just being used to balance the state budget when it could have been used for its intended purpose, which is to make sure that the Railroad Commission is plugging and cleaning up orphaned wells and doing a better job of monitoring and enforcing all of the existing oil and gas wells and injection wells in the state. And so
the legislature is using it as a piggy bank instead of using it for its intended purpose.
Exactly. And so these funds, even though they are intended to protect the environment and protect public safety, are just being used like a savings account to make it look like there's a ton of money sitting around in the state. And so, and the crazy thing about all of this is that even with the under-allocated amount of money that the Railroad Commission gets for paying for well plugging and cleanup, it still takes up 45% of the agency's budget.
So does that leave room for them to do things like inspections, monitoring?
So I'm glad you asked that. They only spend 21% of their budget on monitoring and inspections. And we hear from impacted landowners all the time that, they're not responding to complaints. They're not coming out and doing thorough inspections on their properties when things go wrong. And so it's really troubling to see that there is so much money being spent on oil and gas well plugging and cleanup, but it is still somehow never enough. And so little money being spent on monitoring and inspections to be able to prevent things from getting worse.
So they're spending more time and resources being garbage men instead of being the policemen and firemen that they're supposed to be.
That's a great way of putting it. And so, let's see. We talked a little bit. I mentioned a little bit. There's this huge glut of money, in the state budget this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on with oil and gas economics right now, and why now is an important time to be talking about this?
Well, we mentioned this in an earlier episode, but it bears repeating. The state of Texas is doing very well right now, at least oil and gas operators in the state of Texas. And, we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation based on the prices right now, the global prices for crude oil. And there is enough profit sloshing around in the state of Texas that can cover the entire orphan well inventory in 2 days. Let's just say they don't pocket that money and buy that latest yacht, and instead they just pay to clean up their mess. They could do it in 2 days of profit.
That's insane. So why don't they?
Because no one's making them. Like, that's it.
Cue the Railroad Commission.
We need like a
air horn.
Yeah.
How do we get your attention? God. And so, our solution here is that the Railroad Commission needs to revise the fees and surcharges that they charge to industry that become revenue for the Oil and Gas Regulation and Cleanup Fund and the General Revenue Fund that are primarily used as funds to pay for well plugging and cleanup in the state of Texas. That's like the number one thing that they can do to make sure that these orphaned wells can get plugged quickly. And I guess I just want to share one other story of how this is impacting folks. We've talked about some other tragedies. Right now, there's also, a landowner out in Pecos County who has 112 orphaned wells on his property. And, just like Antina Ranch, he's playing whack-a-mole. It's like as soon as the Railroad Commission plugs one well, another one starts leaking. And so the commission, instead of going and having enough money to plug all the orphaned wells as soon as they are orphaned, they let these wells sit around for years and years and years, and then they become $1 million problems when they could have cost tens of thousands of dollars to plug. And they become problems for landowners who now can't do any agriculture on soil that is completely salted, that has radionuclides on it, and their groundwater is potentially contaminated. So the moral of the story is, if companies don't pay, then we pay.
So I'm a Louisiana lady, and we have a little word to describe something extra, and that's lagniappe. And we have a few other recommendations that are in the report, and this is a plug for the report, pun intended. Go read it. There's a lot of good information in there and recommendations that apply to Texas, but really any state regulatory program. And the point that we wanted to leave our audience with is that the United States is the biggest producer of oil and gas on the planet right now. And that is primarily because of the state of Texas. In terms of regulators, the Railroad Commission of Texas is the most important oil and gas regulator on the planet right now. And they can either be a vanguard and lead on how to do this well, or they can continue to aid and abet fraud and negligence. And we like to think that the good people at the Railroad Commission want to do the former. They want to be the vanguard and they want to lead. And the Texas legislature wants to be a steward of Texas resources and protect Texans. And so we're going to leave you with a few of our, little lagniappe ideas. And so, one thing we want to first focus on is at the same time we are subsidizing oil and gas operators by cleaning up their messes, we are also giving them buckets of money through incentives and subsidies in Texas. And this is money that's coming from, Texan pockets. And there's a whole suite of, if you go to our report, you can see all of these marginal tax incentives, all kinds of tax incentives that basically pay operators when we should be focused instead on collecting from this industry to make sure that we can pay to clean up this mess.
And, there's a really important tangible reason why we need to make sure that operators pay right now. And that is because these wells don't go away once they're plugged, right? They sit around for decades, for centuries.
Yeah.
They're going to be around forever. And because, the things that we do in Texas, geologically, mining-wise, to the subsurface, are dynamic. There's always new stuff happening, new wells being drilled. And so these wells that are currently there, whether they are plugged or not, could start failing in different ways in the future for future generations.
Absolutely.
And so we need to make sure that we're collecting money right now from these for-profit, very profitable companies, because they are not going to be around to deal with the problems that are caused in the future from these well bores.
There's two lessons we've learned over the last few years, and one is that wells are not plug and done. And the Antina Cattle Ranch demonstrates that pretty ominously, that a well, even plugged by a multi-billion-dollar company, might fail and might pose tremendous amount of problems for landowners and people in Texas. And number two, it always comes back to the doorstep of the people. Even if a company fails, a company moves out of the state, it is going to behoove the Railroad Commission of Texas to monitor these wells and to deal with them in perpetuity. And so we have some recommendations in this report on how to structure repivot the Railroad Commission to monitor these wells in perpetuity, because these are forever wells. These are forever problems, and it requires an agency that's poised and staffed and funded to deal with this and protect the public and the water resources and agricultural resources of Texas.
You put that so well, Megan. Thank you so much for joining me for this video series about our big report, Eliminating Orphaned Wells and Sites in Texas. We hope that everyone will like and subscribe to our channel so that, and please share these videos, watch all the videos. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. And Virginia, thank you for being a steward of Texas resources and being a real advocate and champion for the people of Texas.
Absolutely.